Amen. Welcome back, everyone. So we are continuing on, and just to give a brief recap of where we ended, we had just discussed, we had looked at the line of the papacy here, the rise of papal power, and we looked here at the rise of the United States power, and we also identified, and we paralleled the two. We saw the similarities, that it goes through the same process. And we identified in the United States that this message is, let me say it this way, the papal message here is perfect, but it's perfect in its papal error, if that makes sense. It's perfect for its satanic message. This is exactly what their master Satan intended for them. He wanted them to be exactly as they were, and that all gets put into Justinian's decree, and they start doing their work. And they don't start failing at their work till they get to the very end of their history. Same thing with the United States. The Lord put in place these principles and a freedom, which is literally the exact opposite of this line underneath. They're opposites. And the principles of liberty get enshrined in the Constitution, and I'm suggesting that that document is perfect, and it's going to do its work. And as you go forward in time, eventually there's going to be an apostasy from that. But one of the things where we exactly left off was that to say the Constitution is perfect, I need to add a few caveats to that, explanations. And one explanation I was using was that what we see with the Constitution, or what we see with the first angel's message, is that the first angel's message can't be separated from the second and the third. And it needs the second and the third to give it the added information that it needs to finish the job in which it was meant to do. And so just like the first and second and the third angel's message, the Constitution needs something to help it get through this history to accomplish the work it's supposed to accomplish. And I was suggesting that that is the amendment system. It allows you to add to that document things that are necessary as you go through time. The founders obviously couldn't prepare for everything, and they knew that, and they left a back door to add to that document. And another thing I want to say to that is that we will explore the idea at some point that there are things in the Constitution that need additional light but have fulfilled their purpose perfectly up until the moment in which they stop fulfilling it perfectly, if that makes sense. Let me say that differently. You have something in the Constitution that was perfect for its time, perfect for the amount of work that it did, but it needs some amendment to add further light to keep it going, if you can get behind that kind of thought. And we'll try to give specifics on that. I'm sort of just adding these thoughts in presently. And we'll talk about some of these as we go forward. Now, the first problem when you say that the Constitution is perfect, for me, the first problem you have to get around is the biggest issue of slavery, and because slavery, as we know, if we'd use Sister White's understanding of slavery and just, common sense understanding of slavery, it was wrong, and it was a bad thing. And one of the arguments that we're going to talk about is that in the beginning of this history, even from the Constitutional Convention in 1787, all the way through till the beginning of till 1860, till the Civil War, was the idea, and it's even an idea here at the end of the world, is the idea that the founders framed the Constitution in racism, and that they institutionalized slavery in the document of the Constitution. And we need to, if that is true, if that's a true statement, then what I'm saying about the Constitution can't hold water, just because there's a egregious error in it, like that. There's no way, you can't say slavery was a time and circumstance kind of situation. It was just either wrong or it's right. And so that's one of the ideas we're going to have to wrestle with. And I'm not sure if anyone here has had that view of the Constitution, that it enshrined slavery. If you did, hopefully I can we can talk about that and come to a better understanding. I can be changed, or you can be changed in that understanding. But the way I want to proceed through that is to give us the history of the first 70 some odd years of the United States and try to look at the ideas that the founders had. So I'm going to take this history here. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to erase this on top here and get rid of these. And I'm just going to look at the history all the way up to the Civil War, and we'll look through the Civil War. But the Civil War began in 1861. This is the Civil War. And it's going to go till 1865. And so I just want to look at this history here from 1798 to 1861. I may need to expand this out a little bit, but we'll find out. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Constitutional Convention itself in 1787. And we mentioned that just a little bit, that during the Constitutional Convention, one thing that most people aren't familiar with is that they locked themselves in the room. The delegates from the colonies lock themselves in a building like this, and they say, we're going to stay in here, and we're going to be sequestered till the end of this process, and no information is going to leak out of this convention. And they had some really important reasons for doing that, and we'll read some of the commentary on that as we go forward. Frederick Douglass has some thoughts on that. And so they lock themselves in, don't let any information out, and they deliberate about all the different parts of the Constitution. And as we said, during this time, slavery is still a big deal. And at least in the South it is, and it's becoming less and less popular in the North. And as we were saying before, there's lots of emancipation efforts that are taking place in this history to free the slaves in certain states. Now there's different kinds of emancipation. Some people favored gradual emancipation, some favored immediate emancipation. And gradual emancipation was that you would allow, so for instance, you have your first generation of slaves, and that generation of slave is going to die in slavery. But the way the gradual part comes in is that they would allow the next generation, the child of that slave, let's say you have a mother and father slave, that they would allow the child of that slave to work till a certain amount of time in servitude, and then they would release them. And most of the time it was after the prime of their life, so that they could, the prime of the life of the child, so that they would get the best service out of them. So they would let you out at like 28 or something like that, or 29 or something, and they'd get your 20s from you. And then you would be free, and now you're a free slave, and you can go live your life. There's different variations of that gradual emancipation, but those were the two options really, either gradual or immediate. And there was different opinions on which one it should be. But in the North, they were doing both. And many of them just totally, several of them at least, abolished slavery outright. So that is the history in which we're dealing with. And the founders have this problem because they're facing the conundrum of what to do with this. Because, again, for us to ratify a document, everyone needs to agree on it. All 13. If we have 13 people here, all 13 people need to say yes. And if all 13 people don't say yes, 13 colonies, then it's not going to pass. Or it does pass, and we're actually a 12-colony country, or an 11-colony country, or a 7-colony country, because there was such a division within the convention that you're not going to get all the colonies together. And so that was that problem they were facing, as well as how to get everyone on board. And they were kind of tricky in the way that they were able to, and I'm going to say it this way, they were tricky in the way that some of the founders were tricky in the way that they inserted arguments, or they inserted, I don't know the right way to say it, they got around the South's problems. The founders who wanted to support abolition and were anti-slavery, they were able to get around the problems of the southern states in really tactful ways, and we'll talk about that as we go forward. So that's the history we're dealing with here. And Let's just read some of these. So one thing I mentioned was that they sequester themselves in this building here for about 6 months. I think it's about 6 months, maybe a little bit more. And what happens is all of those documents, all the notes, anything anyone took down of what took place there was locked away. Nobody was allowed to have it. And the first information that was able to be released about what actually took place inside the convention and some of the arguments that were taking place was when James Madison dies. And James Madison was a Virginian, and he was probably he's probably the most famous architect and the most important architect of the Constitution. And what he's going to do is he takes all these notes, but he makes somehow, I don't know exactly how he does it, but he allows for his notes to be made public on his death. So once he dies, his notes become available to everyone. And his notes, he dies in 1836. 1836. Well,
1836 is, okay, sorry.
am I right?
No, that's good. Yeah, sorry.
Were you going to say it's after or before?
Yeah, I was thinking Civil War.
Oh, sorry. Madison dies. So he's going to die, his notes get released, and he has some really important statements in his notes that help us to understand the ideas of the founders, or the framers, at that time. And I just want to read this. This is from the New York Times. In 1836, the wealthy slaveholding Virginian James Madison died, the most important architect of the nation. He made possible the publications of his notes, breaking the seal of the convention's agreed-upon secrecy. They revealed that during a key debate over import duties on the slave trade, he had persuaded the framers not, quote, to admit in the Constitution the idea that there could be property in men. The reason of duties did not hold, as slaves are not like merchandise consumed, end quote. So one thing we want to pick up from this phrase from here from Madison is his notes, is that he got the framers to agree not to include the phrase or the idea even of property in man. And we're going to continue to come back to this thought as we go forward, is the idea of having property in man. Because the second you make a man property, you take away his rights as a human being. You make him not human, because humans can't be property. You either are a human or not a human. And there's no two ways about that. And continuing on. With the posthumous revelation, this person, I don't know how to say his name very well, argues that the framers left room for political efforts aimed at slavery's restriction and eventually its destruction, even amid a constitution that safeguards slavery. So, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. So the idea is that they left room here to maneuver around slavery, and we'll try to explain how that is. So another delegate who was present during the Constitutional Convention, his name was Elbridge Gerrys, says this. He makes the declaration that the convention should have, quote, nothing to do with the conduct of the states as to slavery, but ought to be careful not to give any sanction to it. So that almost seems like a little bit of a contradiction. And we're going to see this going forward, this idea, and there's an idea here. So the idea is, he's saying, is in our Constitution that we're going to frame, we're not going to sanction slavery. But he says at the same time, even though we're not going to sanction it, we're not going to intervene in the states that have slavery. And so it's a complex thought right there, and we're going to see that more and more as we go forward. They're kind of walking on this dagger's edge. Okay, and then one more statement. This is from Madison. The convention's repudiation of so during the convention, they have this point, they have several points. One of the points is they want to add this pro-slavery proposal, or this clause, into the Constitution, and Madison says this. Madison recorded, quote, seemed to which some provision should be included in the favor of property and slaves. But he had already said before that he's against adding anything that says that slaves are property into the Constitution. And those are kind of hard quotes because they're a little bit, they don't have the full context around them, but we're going to read some more about this as well. But those are some of the things, and we'll quote from some other founders at the time. And now we're going to go into the Constitution a little bit and talk about it. But before we do that, I just want to reiterate the fact, what they did, in this is the way they frame it, and I'll just tell you where we're going with this so you can try to conceptualize it as we go, is in the United States we have, as you know, you have the federal government and you have the states. And there's that distinction between the two of them. And there's state law and there's federal law, which are two different things. State law is, the states make their own laws. They set their own rules, they make their own laws, but they have to be, but they're subordinate to the federal government, let me say it that way. And there's certain things that the federal government doesn't touch. It doesn't allow or disallow because it goes to the states. They let the states make those decisions. And one of those things here is slavery. But not one of the problems, but what the founders tried to do was to make it so that the federal government was that the federal government was anti-slavery, while it allowed the states to pick whether they were pro-slavery or anti-slavery. Does that make sense? So when you look at the states, you have the northern states. Even after the ratification of the Constitution, the northern states are anti-slavery. They do the emancipation for all their slaves, and by a certain amount of time, eventually all the northern states no longer, or all the slaves are free by some point, early 1800s. The southern states are still deeply entrenched in it. So the states are allowed to make their own decision. They have, if I can say it this way, there's a little bit of freedom and choice here that is allowed. And so that is the idea they're trying to frame, and what we're going to continually come back to is the idea of property and man. The Confederates continually fight to have the idea of property and man brought into the Constitution, but the framers continually reject that notion and actually do the counter of those things, while at the same time allowing the southern states to feel as though slavery is in the Constitution, and we'll explain that here as we go. It's a confusing thought. But they leave enough room to where the Constitution, as I'm going to suggest, reads nothing to do with slavery. And we'll try to break that down presently. So now we're going to jump into the Constitution. So we're going to look at 3 places in the Constitution. There are only 3 places that talk about what people say is talking about slavery. If you have a device, I would suggest that you look up the Constitution and you pull it up with you, just because the wording is going to be weird and we're going to try to break the wording down, and I don't want to have to keep reading it over and over again. I should have printed something out with these just on it, so that's my bad. But we're just going to read 3 sections of the Constitution, very small sections. Okay. So the first one is Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. This is often referred to as the 3/5 Amendment Clause. Okay, and so what we're going to read about it first, we'll talk about it, see some of the points about it, but then I also want to let Frederick Douglass give us some arguments about it. And we mentioned Frederick Douglass before, and Frederick Douglass is a runaway slave who becomes a abolitionist and is one of the greatest minds of his time. So I think it's important that he was a slave. Because he's going to make an argument that the Constitution doesn't support slavery if you do a careful reading. And he was one of the people in 1860, one of the abolitionists. So what we're going to read from is in 1860. And this is Frederick Douglass. I'm just going to put, just for sake of room, I'm going to put FD, Frederick Douglass. And we're also going to read from Abraham Lincoln at the same time. He's going to make a speech also in 1860, pro-abolition. So one thing I want us to take into account here, and I'll mention this again going forward, but I just want to put it into our minds, is the idea of something we're talking about today. And it's the idea of 2 streams of information. And one thing I want to try to sustain here is that there are two streams of information when it comes to the Civil War history. And it's pretty obvious. You have one that is pro-slavery and one that is anti-slavery. Today, you have the left and the right. It's the same dynamic. And just like today, we are all using the Constitution to some degree. We're all using the Constitution to sustain our positions on the left or the right. The same thing was happening in the time of the Civil War. You had the pro-slavery people and the anti-slavery people both reading the same Constitution and making either a pro-slavery argument or an anti-slavery argument. So again, you have those two streams going on here. And what I want to suggest is that just like today, we know that the side, let me say it this way, we know that one side is correct and one side is right, and their arguments are correct or right. You know, their main points of that, let me say it that way. The same thing was going on here, that the people who are abolitionists are going to make pretty much all the same argument, and it's all about the idea of property and man. There are those who are going to make a religious argument, and there are those who are going to go so far in an extreme way, and we'll hear about these people. You're going to hear about the people called the Garrisonians. And they're after a man, I forget his first name, but it's something Garrison. And he was a abolitionist, so he's on the right side of the issue. But not only was he an abolitionist, but he also thought, because of his views of what he thought the Constitution said about slavery, which he thought it was pro-slavery, he said we need to dissolve the government and fight the government. You don't vote, you don't do anything, you dissolve the government, and we start over with a new Constitution in this day. And so he's on the right side of the issue, but has a problem with some of his ideas. So there's that kind of person. So it's not entirely pure in that everyone is using the same argument. But two people we're going to specifically highlight in this history is Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln as our main witnesses for this thought. And both of them are speaking around the year 1860, right before the Civil War. I think actually we're going to quote just from the year 1860. Okay, so that was some preparation. Now we're going into it. You had time to get into your constitutions. We're looking at Article 1, Section 2. And so we'll read through it, and then I want to let Frederick Douglass give his argument on the topic as well, because he makes some really interesting arguments that you wouldn't even think of if you weren't there, I guess. Okay, so this is the first one, Article 1, Section 2. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within the Union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, excluding Indians not taxed, and then it says 3/5 of all other persons. So this is called the 3/5 clause. And the idea here is that anyone who could be other people, whatever you define as other persons, are going to be taxed, but they're also going to have 3/5 of their count of their vote in Congress. Does that make sense? Or in representation. They're not counted as population, because when you come to the House of Representatives, it's based upon population. The Senate is the same for everyone. You have 2 people in the Senate, and then depending on how many people your population has, is how many delegates you get in the House of Representatives. Does that make sense? Did I lose anyone there? Yes? No? Everyone good? Okay. If you're not, speak up. So what this does is it makes all other persons count as 3/5 of a vote. And so you need 2 persons of other people to make a full vote. There's a numbers problem there. And so that's the idea. And now what we're going to repeatedly see here with what the framers did and with what Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln are going to argue is that by the use of the word persons, they are directly telling you that they're not sanctioning slavery, because a slave is someone who's counted as property. And property is not a person. Person and property are different things. And if you read this explicitly the way it's written, it does not allow you to say that slavery is in this clause. There's no slavery mentioned here explicitly. And they're going to make the argument that you need explicit statements to understand that. It's not just an interpretation. You need some explicit statements to make that point. Now, in an actual way, this obviously counts for slaves. Slaves are going to be counted as other people, and they're going to be 3/5 of a person. But but another thing that they see is that aliens also count as 3/5 of a person. So there's other people included in this that some of the argument is going to be around, that it's not just about slaves. And this is the razor's edge that I'm talking about, because technically, you read this and you say, okay, has nothing to do with slavery, if you're going to be very technical about the argument. But based upon interpretation and the way it was used at this time, you can say, okay, it is about slavery. So you could see how you can come to either conclusion about that thought. And so let's read for this one clause, let's read from Frederick Douglass, and let me just pull it up. It might take just a moment. So I'm going to start from the middle of his thing. He's in a long speech. The context of this is that he's in a debate in the year 1860 between him and another abolitionist, but the other abolitionist is making the thought that is framing the thought that the Constitution is about slavery. Frederick Douglass is saying it's not about slavery. And so they're arguing about it, and he says, let me find it, sorry, I'm missing it. Give me 1 second. Okay. Sorry, I'm missing it. It's right around here. It's in the middle of the thing and I didn't mark it very well. Okay, here it is. I got it. These are the provisions. With the name of the document?
Yeah.
Okay. Give me 1 second because it's going to mess me up where I am. But give me 1 second. Here it is. This is 1860 Frederick Douglass. It's called The Constitution of the United States, : is it pro-slavery or anti-slavery? And it's his whole speech. Okay, so here it is. So he's going to list the provisions that we're going to read, and then he's going to talk about them one by one. And so I'm jumping into that thought. Let us look at them just as they stand, one by one. Let us grant, for the sake of argument, that the first of these provisions, referring to the basis of representation and taxation, does refer to slaves. So what he's going to say is we're going to take these arguments and we'll talk about them one by one. And the first one we're going to look at is the one we just read. And he's going to say, for sake of argument, for sake of your argument, he's going to argue from a disadvantaged ground. He's not even going to make his full point, because his point is that the actual wording doesn't allow for you to see slavery, but he's going to make the point. So let's say the word slave was in there. Even if it was in there, let me argue from your perspective. And then he says this. So let's, referring to this basis of tax representation, let us look at them just as they stand one by one. Let us grant, for the sake of argument, that the first of these provisions, referring to the basis of representation and taxation, does refer to slaves. We are not compelled to make that admission, for it might fairly apply to aliens, and that's what I was saying before. So he's saying, I don't even have to make that argument, but I'm going to. And he says, persons living in the country, but not naturalized, aliens, but giving the provision the very worst construction, what does it amount to? I answer, it is a downright disability laid upon the slave-holding states, one which deprives those states of 2/5 of their natural basis of representation. A black man in a free state is worth just 2/5 more than a black man in a slave state, as a basis of political power under the Constitution. Therefore, instead of encouraging slavery, the Constitution encourages freedom by giving an increase of 2/5 of political power to free over slave states. So much for this 3/5 clause. Taking it at its worst, it still leans towards freedom, not slavery. For, be it remembered that the Constitution nowhere, For, be it remembered that the Constitution nowhere forbids a colored man to vote. Okay, so he just says that one. I'll end there before we get to the next one that he's going to touch on, which was the next point. So he's saying here, even if you say it does have to do with slavery, which he's saying it doesn't, or that you can explicitly read slavery into it, he's saying even if it was talking about slavery, which you can't prove because it could affect aliens who are naturalized but not full citizens, that even if it was, it actually is an encouragement against slavery because it gives 2/5 more power to a black man in the North than it does to a black man in the South. So it's actually putting a restriction on their ability to vote. It actually gives them less power because at this point, by 1860, you have to remember, at least where he's standing, the whole North is already free. So the North has a full population count of all minorities, of everyone there, of black and white, because they count as a free person. So if you make a slave free, you get their full voting power. If you don't, you get penalized. And so he's saying it actually leans towards freedom. Okay. Does anyone have any questions on that? Feel free to ask questions. If you think something's a bogus answer by Frederick Douglass or by me, please state.
Did we read in the Constitution referring to the voting that you're talking about?
Yes, we actually did. I'll read it again if you need me to. I'll read it for you. Representatives, this is Article 1, Section 2. Representatives in direct taxes shall be apportioned, representatives is the voting part, shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within the Union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined. So he's saying the way you count the delegates shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all their persons. So he's saying, so the Constitution is talking about representation. Do you see that? Okay. Any questions about that before we continue? Let's talk about these ones. Anyone have any problems with that thus far? What? It's not your Constitution, man. I got to do this in front of Americans. You guys don't care enough.
You'd be worrying about it, but it was.
Yeah, that's funny.
3/5 of all other persons is for slaves as well.
It is for slaves, and what the argument he's making there is it's also aliens. His point is that you can read other groups of people into this other than just slaves.
Right.
But again, the razor's edge that they're walking on here is the fact that they understood it to mean slaves as well. They understood that this was about slaves, and by they I mean the southern states when they said, okay, we can accept that, because as they read they read this thing, they say, okay, 3/5 of all the persons, 3/5 of slaves. They took away persons in their mind and they say 3/5 of slaves, and so they saw a safeguard of slavery within the Constitution. So a lot of this becomes about reading. Any other thoughts?
Just to clarify, so the South supported slavery.
Yes.
The North are already emancipated, a lot of them.
A lot of them, not all of them, yes.
And representation by population, 3/5 of a vote for the slaves and aliens in the South would be
yes.
less than, 2/5 less than
Mhm.
in the North, where those same bodies of people, slaves and aliens, would count for a full vote.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore,
Well, an alien would still be a 3/5 vote in both. but a slave wouldn't be. Does that make sense?
Yes, and so therefore, in a sense, what Madison is arguing is...
Douglas, Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass is arguing is it's allowing for the slave states to maintain slavery, but at the same time, they're not endorsing slavery.
They're not sanctioning slavery, yes. Yeah, they're not endorsing it. They're tolerating it, but not endorsing it, or sanctioning it, which is important. Yep.
I think Debbie just wanted to, because you said slaves in the north, it's black man in the north.
There's no slaves in the North by that.
That's right.
Yeah. If there is a slave, they count as 3/5.
That's right. So black people, former slaves, or
yeah.
process of being
Yep.
emancipated.
Yes. Yep.
Basically, what it's saying is, if you keep slaves, you're going to be at a disadvantage to the North, who made all the slaves free, because they get a full vote, and you only get a partial vote. So you're going to be making yourself at a disadvantage.
Frederick Douglass is saying you're shooting yourself in the foot by keeping slaves. If you didn't keep your slaves, you would have all the more votes.
Yes.
That's his point.
Yes.
And so he's saying by that definition, the Constitution in that regard, even if you said it is talking about slaves, leans towards freedom.
It's saying it'd be better for you down the road to get rid of slavery.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So he's saying taking it at its worst, it still leads to freedom.
Say that again?
He says, taking it at its worst, it still leads to freedom.
Yes. Taking it at its worst, it still leads to freedom. But his argument is that the word slave's not even in there,
Yes.
which is an important argument for him. Yep.
Aliens are like just people who come into the country like immigrants kind of thing?
He puts a nice little definition. Where's that? Let me find it. Persons living in the country but not naturalized. That's his definition. That was the definition of alien for him.
Be like immigrants, becoming citizens.
I think
Illegal.
no. I don't know a good definition. I don't know the difference between naturalized and maybe somebody can look this up. The difference between naturalized or explain this. Yeah.
My understanding, my brother-in-law is Canadian. He just became a naturalized citizen, and you're not born there.
Okay.
So you start out with maybe a green card, and so you're living there. That would be somebody who'd be an alien,
Okay.
who's allowed to be living there and working there, but you aren't a citizen. But then you can seek citizenship, so you're not become a naturalized.
Oh, they're not. He's not naturalized. That's what he's saying. Okay. Yes. Okay. So this is someone. Okay, that makes sense. I was tripping up on the not. So a person living in the country, but they're not naturalized. So the example he gave was someone like with a green card. You're allowed to be there. You're supposed to be there, but you're not a citizen yet. Someone like that counts as less. They count as a 3/5 as well. Well. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, but then you could.
I mean, maybe then that must have been the case if he's making that argument, because now you wouldn't be able to. Okay. Any other thoughts? Does that make sense so far? Okay. Okay, so this is the next one. The next one is Article 1, Section 9. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. And this is how it reads. The migration and importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such import not exceeding $10 for each person. So let me explain what that one's saying. It's saying the migration, I'll just read the first part again. The migration and importation of such persons. The South wanted that to say the migration and importation of such slaves. That's what they wanted it to say, but the other founders won out and they changed the word to persons instead of slave. Or they didn't allow it to be slaves, they kept it as persons. So that's the word that they're talking about. That's where it's talking about slaves, they're saying. The migration and importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit. Does that make sense so far? Okay. Shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808. So 1808. 1808. So in 1808, so from 1789 to 1808, Congress is not allowed to prohibit the slave trade, is basically what it says, what it's saying. Now, it doesn't explicitly say the slave trade. That's another problem, is it's not explicitly saying that, but the slave trade is falling under that clause. So it's saying you have 20 years, and then Congress is allowed to prohibit the slave trade. Note, it's also important to note that actually 2 years before the slave trade ended, it was the year before, sorry. The year before, in 1807, they pass a law that says the slave trade has to end. And the Atlantic slave trade, that is what is famous for. You know, the triangle trade going from, how does that work? The United States to, I think it's to Africa, and the Caribbean, then to the United States. I think it's that direction, or it goes this way, I can't remember. That's the slave trade that they're talking about. And it's going to be prohibited by that time, or it can't be prohibited, and there's going to be a tax on the import. Okay, so this is what Frederick Douglass is going to say about that. I come next to that which is said to guarantee the continuation of the African slave trade for 20 years, 20 years being 1808. I will also take that for just what my opponent alleges it to have been, I will also take that for just what my opponent alleges it to have been. Although the Constitution does not warrant any such conclusion, but to be liberal, let us suppose it does, and what follows? Why this? Why this? That this part of the Constitution, so far as the slave trade is concerned, became a dead letter more than 50 years ago, and now binds no man's conscience for the continuation of any slave trade whatsoever. Mr. Thompson is just 52 years too late in dissolving the Union on account of this clause. He might as well dissolve the British government because Queen Elizabeth granted to Sir John Hopkins to import Africans into the West Indies 300 years ago. But there is still more to be said about this abolition of the slave trade. Men at that time, both in England and in America, looked upon the slave trade as the life of slavery. The abolition of the slave trade was supposed to be certain death of slavery. Cut off the stream and the pond will dry up, was the common notion at the time. Wilberforce and Clarkson, clear-sighted as they were, took this view, and the American statesmen, in providing for the abolition of the slave trade, thought they were providing for the abolition of slavery. This view is quite consistent with the history of the times. All regarded slavery as an expiring and doomed system, destined to speedily disappear from the country. But again, it should be remembered that this very provision, if made to refer to the African slave trade at all, makes the Constitution anti-slavery rather than for slavery. For it says to the slave states, the price you will have to pay for coming into the American Union is this, that the slave trade which you would carry on indefinitely out of the Union shall be put an end to in 20 years if you come into the Union. Does that make sense? Slavery, if it does not apply, secondly, if it does not apply, it expires by its own limitations more than 50 years ago. Thirdly, it is anti-slavery because it looks to the abolition of slavery rather than the perpetuity of it. Perpetuity. Fourthly, it shows the intention of the framers of the Constitution were good, not bad. I think this is quite enough on this point. Does that make sense what he's saying there? I think that one's pretty clear. He's saying if it is talking about slavery, which he says you can't prove because it doesn't use the word slave or slavery, if it is talking about that, then it is anti-slavery because what it says to the southern states is that if you're going to join this union, you have 20 years and then we're cutting you off. We're going to cut the streams of the Atlantic slave trade. And his point was, at the time, they thought if you cut the streams, if you block the streams, the river would dry up. Now, it wasn't the case, and we can talk about that going forward. The southern states were able to really entrench themselves after this point, and even though they weren't importing slaves, they had enough slaves to where their slaves produced more slaves, just children. And they were able to continue through that time. And there was a big battle of that. So the founders they had good intentions in that they thought if you cut it off, it would end the slave trade, but in reality, it didn't affect it as much as they would have hoped. But his idea is that all of that points to good intentions, not bad intentions, that it was an anti-slavery document, not a pro-slavery document. Okay, so the next one. Let me just look really quick, sorry. So the next one we're going to look at is also I want to add this thing. Frederick Douglass doesn't add this point, but it's a really important point. Let me read the first sentence again. The migration and importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit. Now I read that fast, but let me just read this one part. Such persons as any of the states now existing shall think to permit. What's the important clause there? Important thought. What? Such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit. Now existing. So what is this doing? What does this clause do? It says the only people the only states that are allowed to have slavery at all, or to partake of this system at all. And again, he's saying, well, may not even talk about slavery, but if you're going to say it's talking about slavery, it's saying that the only people who are allowed to import slaves into their state are the states that are now existing, which are the 13 colonies. So what has now happened is that the federal government or the Constitution bans slavery by extension, because of this clause, into any of the federal territories or any state after the 13 states. So that's a big point. It's putting limits around slavery and trying to shrink it down instead of letting it expand. Does that make sense? So, yep.
In modern vernacular, we would perhaps be able to say, they grandfathered in, so existing states of the 13 colonies in the Union were allowed to keep it, those that were slaves, as opposed to none others. It had opened it up to.
Yeah.
So it was
Yep.
nipping it in.
Yeah, exactly. And there's going to be battles over this. Actually, this is part of the reason they secede from the Union, is because they want to push slavery into the West, and they think they have a constitutional right to do it, but they don't let them do it. And it's part of the secession, and we'll talk about that later. Question?
No.
Okay. Anyone else? Yep.
You're presenting, I see exactly what you're presenting. How do they come up, I'm reading it the way you're reading it, how do they come up with the other side? This supports slavery, just the fact that they're talking about other persons, and hey, because it says other persons, that means slavery, and because it says it's in there, it supports it?
Yes. That's part of the argument.
It's a simple argument?
They use history as their contextual definition, which is, you're allowed to do that. They're saying, we know what we said in the room. We know what we were saying at that time, and the idea was we want a protection over the Atlantic slave trade. And they're saying, put that clause into the document. And the founders, and the other founders, because it's half and half, remember, the other founders said, we won't do that. What we will do is we will say that the migration and importation of such persons, and the southern states said, I can manipulate that to allow me to have slaves. And you can manipulate that to allow yourself to have slaves, but technically it doesn't allow for slavery. And it's really important and subtle distinction. Does that make sense? Yeah. So they have a ground to stand on. They have something they're standing on, but There's more to the story than that.
Isn't by saying 3/5, you're devaluating certain people? So that's what would make them believe that they're slaves?
Something like that too. The devaluation of someone by saying you have 3/5 of other persons. And it's sort of a contradiction, not a contradiction, but there's two sides to it, because you say, okay, because the South is going to say 3/5 of slaves, right? That's how they're going to read that. But the North is going to say 3/5 of other persons. And what is a person? Person's a human being. It's someone who has unalienable rights according to the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. So there's a fight even within that phrase of 3/5 of other persons, because the word persons allows it to be a human being, while slave is property. And so what I want you to see is they're just right on the edge. They're on the dagger's edge right there. And they're going to tactfully finesse this. And my point is that they tactfully finesse this argument of slavery within the Constitution as to tolerate it, but at the same time not to sanction it. Because as I was saying to my brother over here, they have justification to say that they can use slavery they can have slavery in their states, but federally slavery is not allowed, there's two sides to that. So the Constitution says no slaves, but it also says those who have slaves, you're allowed to keep slaves, though it doesn't explicitly say that. And that's the problem, is it's not explicitly said. Either way, it's just the language in which you read. It's how you're interpreting the language. Any other questions about this one? Okay. So the next one we're going to look at is it's vernacular, not called this in the Constitution, but the vernacular for it is called the Fugitive Slave Clause. This is Article 4, Section 2. Article 4, Section 2. And this is the last one we'll look at of this Constitution. The Fugitive Slave Clause. Give me 1 second. Let me find something. Okay, here we go there. And this is Article 4, Section 2. No person held in service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from the service or labor, but shall be delivered shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom service or labor may be due. Read it one more time. No person, in person there's, some people read that as slave, some people read that as other. No person held in service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another state, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from the service or labor, but shall be delivered up to the claim to the party whom service or labor may be due. So if you have someone who's in bondage in one state and they escape to another, it doesn't mean you're free. You're still a slave because they're going to have to go back to just because you change the locations doesn't change the fact that you're a slave or not. You still have due service. Here's the problem. The clause is worded very ambiguously. And it doesn't say slave, it says anyone who owes service or labor. An apprentice of a master, is someone who owes service or labor. So if you're an apprentice to someone and you have a certain amount of time that you're supposed to be an apprentice and you flee to another state, you still have to go back to the apprentice, or so go back to your master, because you have service that needs to be rendered. If you're an indentured servant or something like that, which isn't full slavery. There's many different things in which can be covered by the ambiguity of this. Anyone who's bound to service for any period of time. And this is an important distinction, the ambiguity of it. It does cover slaves, technically. Technically, a slave is someone who is bound by service or held in service or labor in one state, and if they flee, they're under that law, or they're under that umbrella, but technically it's not saying the word slavery. And let's read what Frederick Douglass says. He says this: This is called the fugitive slave provision. It is called so by those who wish to make it subvert the entrance. Sorry, it is called so by those who wish to make it subverse the interest of slavery in America, and the same by those who wish to uphold the views of a party in this country. And he's talking about the southern states. It is put thus in the speech at the city hall. Let us go back to 1787 and enter Liberty Hall, Philadelphia, 1787. So we're right back there at the Constitutional Convention, where sat in the convention the illustrious men who framed the Constitution, with George Washington in the chair. On the 27th of September, Mr. Butler and Mr. Pinckney, two delegates from the state of South Carolina, moved that the Constitution should require that fugitive slaves and servants should be delivered up like criminals, and after a discussion on the topic or the subject, the clause as it stands in the Constitution was adopted. After this, in the convention, let me read that, let me say that again, okay. After this, in the conventions held in the several states to ratify the Constitution, the same meaning was attached to the words. For example, Mr. Madison, afterwards the president, which is James Madison, the one we've been talking about, when recommending the Constitution to his constituents, told them that the clause would secure them their property and slaves. I kind of butchered all of that because he's actually quoting from his opponent. His opponent is taking this sentence, and he's going to talk about everything I just read. It was in quotations. Everything that I read that was after, let us go back to 1787 in City Hall. From that point to what I just read right there is a quotation by his opponent. And then he says this, I must ask you to look well to this statement. Upon its face, it would seem a full and fair statement of the history of the transaction it professed to describe, and yet I declare unto you, knowing as I do the facts in the case, my utter amazement at the downright untruth conveyed under the fair-seeming words now quoted, everything I quoted to you there, about James Madison and about Washington, all those people. The man who could make such a statement may have all the craftiness of a lawyer, but who can accord to him the candor of an honest debater? What could more completely destroy all confidence in his statement? Mark you, the orator had not allowed his audience to read the provision of the Constitution to which he referred. He merely characterized it as one to deliver up fugitive slaves and servants like criminals. So he's going to insert, the debater inserts the phrase, deliver up fugitive slaves and servants like criminals. So he's inserting that into the Constitution, and Frederick Douglass is saying that's not what it says. And then he says, and tells you that this was done after discussion. So he's saying they discussed it and that's what they said, yeah, we're going to deliver up fugitive slaves like criminals. But he took good care not to tell you what was the nature of the discussion. He would have. It's a typo, yeah. Would have spoiled the whole. He would have spoiled the whole effect of his statement had he told you the whole truth. Now, what are the facts connected with this provision of the Constitution? You shall have them. It seems to take two men to tell the truth. It is quite true that Mr. Butler and Mr. Pinckney introduced a provision expressly with the view to recapture fugitive slaves. It is quite true also that there was some discussion on the subject, and just here the truth shall come out. These illustrious kidnappers, who were told promptly that we're told promptly in that discussion that no such idea as property in man should be permitted into the Constitution. The speaker in question might have told you, and he would have have told you, but the simple truth, if he had told you that the proposition of Mr. Butler and Mr. Pinckney, which he led you to infer was adopted by the convention that from the Constitution was in fact promptly and indignantly rejected by the Constitution. He would have told you it suited his purposes to do so, so that the words employed in the first draft of the Fugitive Clause were such as applied to the condition of slaves and expressly declared that persons held in servitude should be given up, but that the word servitude was struck from the provision for the very clear reason that it applies to slaves. So I kind of butchered reading that a little bit, but what he's saying so far is that the debater is saying, look, the debater is saying, yeah, it's the Fugitive Slave Clause. It allows slaves and those in servitude to be brought back like criminals to their respective states. But Frederick Douglass is saying that's not at all what it says, because they tried to insert that language into the discussion and tried to get it into the Constitution, but people like James Madison stood up and fought that and made it so what it actually said was not speaking directly to slavery, but anyone who's owes any service. And so they directly fought the idea of making property in man, and that's what he said there, which is, again, the continual theme we're going to see is the idea of property in man. He might have told you that the same Mr. Madison declared that the word was struck out because the convention would not consent that the idea of property in man should be admitted in the Constitution. The fact that Mr. Madison can be cited on both sides of this question is another evidence of the folly and absurdity of making the secret intentions of the framers the criteria by which the Constitution is to be construed. But it may be asked, if this clause does not apply to slavery, to whom does it apply? And he's going to answer, and he's going to say, I'll give you this. I answer that when adopted, it applies to a very large class of persons, namely redemptioners, persons who had come to America from Holland, from Ireland, and other quarters of the globe, like the coolies to the West Indies. I don't know what that is, so if that's a bad word. What their East End, is that a derogative kind of thing? Is okay. It is, okay. Anyway, I'm just reading what he says. So he's saying people from the West Indies. So he's saying the people from the West Indies. He's saying the Irish, the people from Holland, all these other people from the quarters of the globe had, for a consideration duly paid, become bound to service and labor for the parties to whom their service and labor was due. It applied to indentured apprentices and others who had become bound for a consideration under contract duly named or duly made to service and labor to such persons as provision applies. Okay, and he says basically it touches all these other people, but it also touches slaves, and that's why the South let it in there, because technically it doesn't say slave, but you can read in slave, and that's what I keep wanting you to see, is that they're reading the word slave into it, and that's why they allowed these amendments, that's why these allowed these parts of the Constitution to be passed, even though it's not explicitly talking about slaves. They said, I can read slave into that, and so by that definition, it safeguards my ability to have slaves. Do we see that? But technically, the document says nothing about slavery. And that's Frederick Douglass's point. You should read the whole thing if you had time, if you're able to read it. It's a long thing. I want to read one more portion of it, and I have it right here. Let me find it. Actually, we're going to close because we're out of time. But, so what I want to say, so first off, I need to apologize. My apology is this. We're reading a ton, and we're going to continue to read at least for another day or two. Maybe just tomorrow. Hopefully we'll get through all the slavery part by tomorrow. So I'm sorry for the tons of reading. But I have to read because we have to prove the point. And I can only prove the point if you understand what some of these people have been saying. So tomorrow we'll finish up with reading. We'll finish the statement from Frederick Douglass, and then we'll also jump into Abraham Lincoln, which is about the same length, maybe a little bit shorter of what we read with Douglass. And and then we'll talk about some more about the context of this history. So what we've done so far is we looked at the context, we looked at the history of the convention in 1787, and we saw that there was this battle over slavery and anti-slavery, and we saw so far what we're trying to show, or what I'm trying to show, is that in the language of the Constitution, it is worded in such a way that it promotes freedom, not servitude or not slavery. And by that definition, if you read these things just as they read these parts of the Constitution is a pure document, if I can say it that way. It's perfect in that way, or at least it's pure. And it's not tainted with slavery or with upholding the institution of slavery, which would be the biggest crime that it could commit if they did try to enshrine slavery into the Constitution. And the reason I have to do this is because I know that there are plenty of people who probably, maybe not here, but in other parts of the world, who might think that the Constitution enshrines slavery into it. And that's what we're trying to talk about, is the facts of that matter. And I think so far, if we take Frederick Douglass in 1860, right before the year before the Civil War, a freed slave who became the model of freedom, I guess. He was one of the most intelligent people of his time, even with the handicap of being a slave. And actually, I didn't read it. I meant to, but there's a quote in here that people were astonished at how brilliant Frederick Douglass was, because he had grew up in slavery and he escaped, and he was able to become one of the wisest and most intelligent people of his time, one of the thinkers. And what I want to say is that we haven't read Abraham Lincoln yet, but Abraham Lincoln and this freed slave, who are both on the right side of abolition, which is the right side of the controversy of the Civil War, are going to make their argument that the Constitution does not uphold slavery. And they're doing it from a constitutional position. And by doing that, they remove the stain of slavery that is put on the Constitution, which allows us to assert the idea that this is a pure information, that a pure message that is being given here in the Constitution. Though, as we said before, it is not a complete message. There's things that need to be added, there's things that need to be touched on, but the idea of its conception is pure. And that's what we're talking about. And that's what we've talked about thus far. And we'll finish up, like I said, we'll finish with Frederick Douglass tomorrow, and we'll jump right into Abraham Lincoln. Okay, let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for this day and this time that we've had, for another day of life, another day of fellowship, and another day of hearing your word. We thank you for this time that we've had, and we ask for the continued blessing. We pray that you'd bless the strength of everyone present and the dedication of those who are taking their time to serve at this convocation. And we ask that you would prepare the hearts of those who are going to be baptized during this next few days, and that you would guide each and every one of us to recommit ourselves to you, Lord, if we haven't already. We ask for your blessing, and we thank you for your love and mercy. In Jesus' name, amen.